When we look at the sub-question of the institutional design and urban transformation, it does look to me that the bulk of the recommendations of very important committees which have been set up to address these issues remain unimplemented. There are 6 broad kind of issues which we need to address ourselves when it comes to the institutional question. First, there is no cohesive integrated plan on how urban existing areas are to be upgraded, pressures on infrastructure, pressures on sanitation, housing, transportation, and environment. Many of these urban bodies lack capacity. There is multiplicity of authority. And looking at all this, it's rather sad, therefore, that the Metropolitan Planning Committee idea, which was part of the 74th Constitutional Amendment, still remains unimplemented, and nor is there any effort to mitigate the unabated urban land market distortions. The second very broad area, I think, on which we need to therefore pay some attention to, is how do you really get urban local bodies sufficiently empowered? Now, the fact remains that notwithstanding the 74th Constitutional Amendment in terms of devolution of financial power, administrative power, and functional powers, this has been implemented in a very haphazard way by most states. And I think that notwithstanding what the 13th Finance Commission has done, there is yet to be agreement not only on the devolution of these powers, but also in terms of the whole election process, the election cycle, the issues of what tenure those elections are to be held, how are power to be assigned, and how, for instance, is there going to be a coordinative entity in which the multiplicity of authority in urban local bodies can be capsuled, which makes accountability patterns clearer and less opaque. The third very important area is the whole area of how do you handle municipal finances. Now, this is easier said than done. What kind of user charges are to be levied? How do you levy them? How do you assess them? How do you deal with the whole area of cross subsidies? And would you be wanting to levy the same rate of charge to the urban poor as you would want to levy it on the somewhat more people who are more affluent? And if you're going to have it uniformly and refund that extra cost, then again the whole issue of targeting urban beneficiaries who are really entitled for a more differentiated treatment, who is to determine that, how is the cross subsidy to be managed, or how is it to be dispensed in what manner, is an area on which there is little thinking so far. And I think that therefore the need for having an urban utility regulator looks to me to be an inescapable one. That's also one of the recommendations of the Ishwar Ahluwalia report, whether you need to have one urban utility regulator, you need to have a different model for different states and for different milieus and different setup. How is it all to be determined? How is cross-subsidy and sunset clauses to be done with? The collection mechanism of it? Because the fact remains that if you do not address this, right now municipal bodies are bankrupt. They can have a large debt overhang on their portfolio. They can raise very little finances. And I think that the obligation, therefore, to give a minimum quality of improved transportation, sanitation, storm system, all that is there will be under-addressed unless you address the whole issue of municipal finances and how are these deliveries to be made. The fourth important area, which I think, is how do you reform this entire issue of the delivery of urban services. This is a contentious and a quasi-political issue on which a reasonable consensus has to be raised. Which part do you really give out to the private sector? What kind of mechanisms do you follow? Do you have concessionary agreements which are really balance the risks on utilizing public assets without flogging it in a manner which has unintended large windfall consequences? And yet if you do not give a rate of return, you would not really have private capital coming into doing that. Are there models which are good examples and which can be replicated? And what kind of public-private partnership? And that's an area, I think, on which we are still exploring a lot, because I think the model of public-private partnership in infrastructure is a more tried one than the model of public-private partnerships in the social sector and in the urban sector. And what kind of an arrangement should we have which makes all this effort environmentally more sustainable. Because I think that one of the advantages that, for instance, India has over China is that clearly there are technology issues on which our options are perhaps wider and more flexible because they have locked in their big investments in the urban sector. We have yet to lock in. And so I think that proper technology choices need to be exercised, where in all this effort, the sustainability is really something which we need to look into. The fifth very important area, in my view, is the whole area of urban housing. Now, there are excessive amount of rules on urban housing. I dare say all the wrong rules, because, for instance, I think that if we recognize that 30 million dwelling units are something which is the minimum shortage, and 98% of this is in the category of low income and economically weaker sections, then how do you reconcile this with the current regulation, for instance, on rigid master plans and restrictive zoning? And finally, I think that the area of urban infrastructure, how to really make the issue of urban infrastructure and the financing of infrastructure credit-worthy, which enables those who are going to put up the infrastructure a model in which they can access market funds to be able to not only build, renew, and strengthen the infrastructure, but to be able to go on in a model which is sustainable. So I think that this whole area of institutional reforms and the area of the urban transformation raises many issues, raises many questions, then it answers.